What if the past is not a straight road, but a landscape full of fog? What if history, as we've been taught to picture it, is only the clean outline of something far messier beneath the surface? Because every so often, an object emerges from the earth that feels almost out of place in time, something too old, too advanced, too strangely preserved, something that refuses to sit quietly inside the timeline we expect. Tonight, we begin with 5 rare discoveries, real artifacts, real sites, real mysteries that challenge not what we know, but how certain we are allowed to feel about knowing it. Not as conspiracies, not as forbidden secrets, but as reminders that the human story is incomplete and the ground beneath us still holds chapters we haven't learned how to read. Our journey begins in a place where decay should win. In the cold forests of central Russia, where water seeps into the soil and winter lingers long into spring, there is a kind of earth that behaves differently. A peat bog. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a wet, dark field. But chemically, it is something else entirely. A slow, acidic world without oxygen. A place where time does not move the way it does anywhere else. In most environments, wood disappears quickly. A fallen tree becomes food for fungi, insects, bacteria. Nature is efficient. Everything returns. But bogs interrupt that cycle. They pickle the world. And in the late 1800s, when miners cut into one of these bogs searching for gold, they struck something harder than mud. Not metal, not stone. Wood. They pulled up dark, heavy fragments of a carved trunk. At first, it seemed like old lumber, but then the shape emerged. A face. A mouth open, as if speaking across centuries. A towering figure, once more than 5 meters tall, carved with deliberate lines and geometric patterns. It was placed in a museum, labeled as a curiosity, perhaps a local relic, perhaps only a few hundred years old. No one yet understood what they were looking at, because the true shock of this object would not arrive until modern science caught up with it. Radiocarbon dating came decades later, measuring the slow decay of carbon inside the wood. The first results were unsettling. Then, the more precise tests came, and the number that returned was almost impossible to hold in the mind. 12,000 years. Let that settle. This statue was carved at the end of the last ice age, before pyramids, before cities, before agriculture had fully reshaped the world. When mammoths still walked across northern plains, someone in the forests of Eurasia carved a monumental figure into a massive larch tree. Not a tool, not a weapon, a symbol, a presence. And that changes something fundamental, because we tend to imagine early humans as surviving, not creating, as hungry, not abstract, as simple, not spiritual. But this idol stands like a contradiction. Its surface holds not just one face, but many, hidden visages stacked along its body, woven into zigzags and patterns that feel almost like a language we can no longer speak. Was it a myth carved in wood? A map of the cosmos? A warning? A gathering point? We don't know. But we do know this. It took time, planning, and cultural meaning to make something like this, which means those people had more than survival. They had imagination. And perhaps that is the first crack in the neat story we tell ourselves about the beginning of civilization. The Shigir Idol survived only by accident, preserved in the chemical stillness of a bog. A single wooden survivor from a world of wooden art that almost entirely vanished. And it leaves us with a question that lingers like mist between trees. If one monument could endure 12,000 years by chance, how many others were lost? And what does it mean that our picture of the past depends so much on what happened by luck to remain? From the frozen peat of Russia, we now travel south into heat, dust, and the first experiments of settled life. Because the next discovery is not carved from wood, it is built from fire. What happens when human beings stop wandering? What happens when a species built for movement decides suddenly to stay, to build walls, to plant seeds, to claim a single patch of earth as home? The Neolithic revolution is often told as a triumph, humanity stepping forward into agriculture, stability, and progress. But progress has a cost, and sometimes the earliest steps towards civilization carry a strange kind of shadow. Our next discovery comes from the Jordanian desert, near the modern city of Amman, where the earth is dry and sun-bleached, and the past lies buried in layers beneath the present. Here stood a settlement called Ain Ghazal. 9,000 years ago, it was enormous by the standards of its time. A true proto-city, housing thousands of people in mud-brick homes clustered along the banks of a river. This was not a small village. This was humanity learning how to live crowded together. And with that density came new pressures: disease, social tension, the stress of strangers living side by side. And in the middle of all this, Ain Ghazal produced something no one expected. In 1983, bulldozers were cutting into the ground to build a highway. Construction was routine, modern, mechanical, until the blade opened a pit filled with what looked at first like human limbs. Work stopped. Archaeologists arrived, and what they uncovered was not a grave of flesh and bone. It was a grave of statues, nearly life-sized human figures made of lime-plaster, their bodies pale and smooth, their faces hauntingly still. Their eyes were the most unsettling part, wide, staring, inhumanly intense. They seemed less like sculptures and more like watchers. To understand why these statues matter, you have to understand the material itself. Lime plaster is not mud. It is chemistry. It requires heat, extreme heat. The people of Ain Ghazal quarried limestone, crushed it, and fired it in kilns at temperatures nearing 900 degrees Celsius. Think about that. This was 7,000 years before modern industry. And yet they were running an energy-intensive process that demanded vast amounts of fuel. Wood, brush, entire hillsides stripped to feed the flames. The lime cycle is almost alchemical. Stone becomes powder. Powder becomes paste. Paste hardens back into stone. It is the transformation of earth through fire. And Ain Ghazal was doing it on a massive scale, not only for floors and walls, but for art. The statues were built with internal reed skeletons, bundles of plant fibers tied together like an armature. Then plaster was layered over them, shaped into torsos, legs, faces. This is the same principle that modern reinforced concrete uses, organic strength beneath mineral skin. But the artistry went further. The pupils of the eyes were made of bitumen, a black, asphalt-like substance that had to be imported from far away, likely from the Dead Sea region. Trade networks already existed, ideas already traveled, and someone carried sticky black tar across desert miles so that these figures could see. Some statues were painted, some were double-headed, two faces emerging from one body, as if identity itself was shared or divided. They were not designed to stand freely. They were meant to be placed in niches, supported, displayed. And for a time, they must have dominated the interior spaces of Ain Ghazal, pale presences inside crowded homes. But the deepest mystery is not how they were made, it is what happened next. Because these statues were not left standing. They were not broken casually, they were buried, carefully, ritually, placed in pits beneath house floors, aligned as if given funerals. Some were intentionally deactivated, broken in a controlled way, not smashed in anger. Why would a society bury its own creations? The leading thought is that these were not decorations. They were ancestors, or spirits, or embodiments of lineage in a rapidly growing settlement where belonging mattered more than ever. In Ain Ghazal, archaeologists also found evidence of skull cult practices, human skulls removed, plastered over, faces remade with shells set into eye sockets. The face was obsession. The face was memory. Perhaps these statues were an extension of that need, to keep the dead present, watching, anchoring the living. In a world where everything was changing, where people were no longer nomads but citizens, these figures may have been the glue holding society together. Or perhaps they were too powerful to remain above ground. Perhaps once their ritual purpose ended, they had to be put to sleep. The earth became their museum, and in burying them, Ain Ghazal unknowingly preserved them for us. But there is a tragic undertone. The very technology that created them may have helped destroy the settlement. The demand for fuel may have stripped the landscape bare. Environmental stress grew. The city was eventually abandoned. The art vanished. Humanity would not create statues of this scale again for thousands of years. Ain Ghazal stands as a reminder that progress is not a straight line. Civilization can surge forward and then forget. When we look into the dark bitumen eyes of these figures today, we are looking at a moment when humanity first tried to transform the earth with fire, chemistry, and memory. And we are left with another lingering question. What does it mean that some of our earliest cities buried their gods beneath the floorboards? And what else, still unseen, lies sleeping under the foundations of the world? From the intimate darkness of these buried watchers, we now rise into open air, into thin mountain silence. Because the next mystery is not hidden underground. It is carved, or perhaps imagined, into the face of a plateau high in the Andes. What do you see when you look at a mountain? Rock? Silence? The bones of the earth? Or do you see a face high in the Andes of Peru, on a remote volcanic plateau called Marcahuasi? Strange shapes emerge from the cliffs and boulders. Some are subtle, others are unmistakable. Profiles, helmets, turtles, lions, and then one formation towers above the rest. A cliff face, 80 feet tall, that, at the right moment, from the right angle, reveals the striking outline of a human head. It is called the Monument to Humanity, and it is here that our next mystery waits. Because the question is not whether these shapes exist. They do. The question is whether they were placed. Did nature sculpt these forms? Or did people, ancient, unknown, long forgotten, shape the stone into meaning? To begin answering that, we have to look closely at the rock itself. The Marcahuasi Plateau is made of volcanic tuff and ignimbrite, materials formed from ancient ash and molten debris cooled into a soft but durable stone. This kind of geology is fertile ground for pareidolia, a phenomenon where the human brain perceives familiar images, especially faces, in random patterns. We see a man in the moon, a rabbit in the clouds, a face in the grain of wood. But pareidolia isn't the end of the story, because at Marcahuasi, it's not just one face, or two, it's dozens. Some seem to change expression depending on the time of day, as shadows stretch and shrink across the stone. From one angle, a face. From another, just rock. Skeptics say this is chance. Erosion sculpted the forms. The mind invented the meaning. But others propose something more nuanced. What if ancient people practiced a kind of proto-sculpture, not carving from scratch, but enhancing what the land already offered? We know this happened in other Andean sites. The Inca revered rocks that bore natural shapes and would sometimes chisel a single line or notch to bring the spirit forth. They didn't believe a stone had to be reshaped entirely to hold power. It only needed to be revealed. Marcahuasi may have been a sacred canvas of this belief. There is archaeological evidence of ancient habitation here: stone houses, burial towers, farming terraces. People lived and died on this plateau. They saw the same shapes we see. Did they enhance them, or simply honor what nature had begun? In the 1950s, a Peruvian explorer named Daniel Russo spent nearly a decade studying Marcahuasi. He lived there, photographed its features, and developed a theory that would stretch far beyond archaeology. He believed these formations were intentional, not just by local hands, but by a lost global civilization he called the Masma. According to Russo, the Masma foresaw a cycle of global cataclysm, a humanity's harvest, as he called it, and carved these monuments as a message to the survivors. He claimed the monument to humanity held multiple racial profiles: African, Asian, Semitic, Caucasian, stacked within its contours. To him, it was a library in stone, a monument of warning. Mainstream archaeology dismisses Russo's theory as fringe, and rightly so. It lacks material evidence, and its reach exceeds its grasp. But his deeper point, that ancient people may have tried to communicate something essential through geology, remains compelling. Because even if these formations are natural, their psychological impact is real. The site draws pilgrims, artists, and seekers. Local shamans describe it as an energy vortex. Geologists confirm that the volcanic rock is rich in quartz and feldspar, minerals that do affect electromagnetic readings. Visitors report vivid dreams, dizziness, euphoria, altitude sickness maybe, or something more subjective, more spiritual. In the end, Marcahuasi is a test of perception, a test of what we consider evidence, and perhaps a test of imagination, because the ambiguity is part of the power. If the rocks are faces, they are faces worn down by time, like memories nearly forgotten. If they are not, then our desire to see them says something profound about who we are. We seek meaning in randomness. We look for gods in the cliffs, watchers in the stone, and the truth may not lie in choosing between nature and human hand, but in the space where the two meet. Perhaps these faces were not carved by chisels, but by ritual, by reverence, by stories told around fires. Perhaps they are not monuments at all. Perhaps they are invitations to look harder, to listen deeper, and to wonder how many other messages in stone we've walked past, dismissing them as accidents of geology. As the high winds sweep across Marcahuasi, we leave the stone faces behind and descend into the rain and mud of northern Britain, where the most organized military machine of the ancient world lost something it should never have lost. Not a weapon, not a battle, a whole legion. How do you lose 5,000 soldiers? How does an empire built on order and record-keeping, on scrolls, stamps, and discipline, simply misplace an entire legion? In the wet, wind-swept hills of northern Britain, where the Roman world once met its wild edge, a mystery lingers. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana. Forged in the fires of the Roman Republic, this elite unit served under Caesar in Gaul, earned its name for victories in Spain, and marched across Europe in the name of empire. By the 1st century AD, it was stationed in Eboracum, modern-day York, a stone fortress standing at the edge of the known world. Here, the Ninth guarded the frontier. They built roads, patrolled the north, and kept uneasy peace with the tribes beyond the wall. And then, around 120 AD, they vanished from the records. No triumphant return, no account of defeat, just silence. The traditional story is dramatic. The Ninth marched north to suppress a rebellion, perhaps against the Picts in what is now Scotland, and were slaughtered. An entire legion wiped out in the mist. The theory fits a narrative. Rome soon after began building Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone barrier spanning the width of Britain, a physical boundary between civilization and chaos. Why build such a wall unless something had gone horribly wrong? But the problem with this theory is simple. Rome hated forgetting. When a battle was lost, they wrote about it. When a legion fell, they memorialized it. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where 3 legions were destroyed in Germany, was seared into the Roman psyche. It was mourned, studied, and never forgotten. Yet no Roman source mourns the Ninth. No poet, no general, no scroll speaks their end. So what really happened? Clues come not from ruins or skulls in Britain, but from stamped tiles found across the sea, in the Netherlands. At a Roman fort in Nijmegen, archaeologists uncovered bricks marked with the insignia of the Ninth Legion, dated to after 120 AD. This alone shatters the massacre theory. If the Ninth was building in Holland, after its supposed destruction, it didn't die in Scotland. The new theory, the Legion was transferred, moved from Britain to the continent, perhaps to reinforce the Eastern Front during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, or to face Parthian threats in Armenia. From there, the trail grows cold. They may have been absorbed into another unit, worn down by attrition, quietly disbanded, or disgraced. Rome had a method for dealing with failure. It was called damnatio memoriae, to strike a name from history. If the Ninth mutinied or abandoned its post, it would be erased, not as punishment, but as erasure of shame. No tombs, no scrolls, no song. Just absence. Modern archaeology searches for traces, mass graves, scorched layers, abandoned forts. Some northern sites show signs of violence, burned timber, sling bullets, but none definitively linked to the Ninth. They may have died not in a final battle, but by degrees, lost in skirmishes, sickness, and imperial downsizing. And there's one more theory, subtler, more haunting. The Ninth didn't die. They dissolved. The Roman Empire, at its height, was also deeply bureaucratic. Paperwork ruled everything. And in a vast, shifting military machine, it's possible the Ninth was broken apart, its veterans reassigned, its name retired, its identity lost in layers of paperwork and war. A legion is not just men, it's a symbol. And perhaps that symbol was quietly shelved when no one could agree what it stood for anymore. But something about the Ninth lingers. Its absence feels personal. Perhaps because we expect the past to be knowable, to be archived, to be held in hand. And when it slips away, it reminds us that even the best-kept records have holes. Even the mightiest institutions can misplace their memory. The silence around the Ninth is not just historical, it's emotional. We feel it. A whole cohort of human lives swallowed not by violence alone, but by time. And that leaves us with this. Not all vanishings are dramatic. Sometimes the story fades because the ink was never written. From the cold mist of Britain, we now move to the warmth of Central America, where something small, a clay head the size of a fist, sits sealed in a grave and refuses to make sense. How does a Roman head end up in an Aztec grave? It's not a riddle, it's a real question, and the object in question is painfully, quietly real. A small terracotta figure, a head with a beard, a furrowed brow, and deep-set eyes. Stylistically Roman, possibly from the 2nd century AD, but it was found buried in Mexico. In 1933, archaeologist José García Payón was excavating a burial site in the Tula Valley just west of modern Mexico City. The site, known as Tecaxic Calixtlahuaca, belonged to the post-classic Mesoamerican world, home to the Aztec and their neighbors in the centuries before Spanish contact. The grave in question was sealed, undisturbed. Inside, beneath layers of soil and stone, lay standard offerings, pottery, ornaments, and something completely out of place, a bearded head made of fired clay, unlike anything ever seen in pre-Columbian art. Mesoamerican civilizations did not depict facial hair. It wasn't cultural. It wasn't physical. It just wasn't done. So why was this head, unmistakably Mediterranean in style, sealed in a grave that predates Columbus? At first, it was an oddity, catalogued, shelved. Then, scholars looked closer. The nose, the eyes, the proportions, the cap. It wasn't just foreign-looking, it was Roman. The resemblance to Hellenistic figurines found in Italy and North Africa was uncanny, but the implications were unsettling. Because if this object was truly Roman, if it crossed the Atlantic before Columbus, then history itself would need rewriting. Naturally, skeptics offered alternatives. A hoax, perhaps? Maybe someone planted the object in modern times? But that theory faltered on the excavation records. Payón was meticulous. His notes were detailed. The context was sealed, untouched for centuries. So in the 1990s, science took its turn. A team from the University of Heidelberg performed thermoluminescence dating, a method that measures the last time a piece of pottery was fired. The results? The head was ancient, most likely fired between 200 BC and 800 AD, not colonial, not modern, Roman. And yet, there it was, buried in a 15th century Mexican grave. So how did it get there? One theory is drift. A Roman ship caught in a storm, blown off course, could have drifted west across the Atlantic, its crew lost, its hull broken, but its cargo carried by currents washing ashore. A small, durable artifact could survive such a journey. Imagine the scene. An indigenous community finds strange wreckage on the beach. Wood, metal, a carved head with a fierce expression. Something from the gods? They would have had no reference point, no Rome, no Europe, just a powerful object from the sea. It could have passed from hand to hand, traded inland, revered, kept, until one day it was buried with someone important, a chief, a priest. 1,000 years later, it would spark confusion, then controversy. Another theory suggests Norse contact. The Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. Is it possible they carried Roman loot, relics from raided monasteries, or ruins? Could such an object have passed through trade from Greenland, down rivers, across continents, to central Mexico? It's unlikely, but not impossible. There is also the unsettling possibility of coincidence, that a native artisan working in clay created a face that just happens to resemble a Roman bust. But this theory strains under the details. No other artifact like it has ever been found in Mesoamerica. The style, the proportions, the realism, none fit local traditions. It stands alone. A black swan in the archaeological record. And black swans are dangerous because they don't just surprise us, they force us to question the model itself. The head doesn't prove transatlantic trade, it doesn't rewrite history alone. But it whispers that the ocean may not have been the wall we thought it was. It may have been a bridge, or at least a messenger, because even if the head arrived by accident, on driftwood, in wreckage, it proves a point often forgotten. The world has always been bigger than we believed. Objects travel, ideas move, and sometimes all it takes to shake a century of certainty is a face sealed in clay, staring up from the dust. From this small enigma, we return to a larger view, to gather these stories and ask, what do they mean together? In our final chapter, we bring the fragments into one frame, because these aren't just puzzles of the past, they are reflections of ourselves. What if these stories aren't anomalies? What if they're signals? Not proof of some hidden conspiracy or forbidden truth, but reflections of something far more human. That history, as we write it, is fragile, and what survives is not always what mattered most. Let's gather the fragments. A wooden idol carved 12,000 years ago, preserved by accident in a Russian bog. Towering, deliberate, inscribed with symbols no one can read. A spiritual artifact from a time before agriculture, before writing, before the beginning of civilization. It tells us that culture, art, memory, belief, did not begin with farms or cities. It began with people, with questions, with ritual in the forest. Then, Ain Ghazal, a settlement that burned its trees to create white statues with bitumen eyes. Statues that were not made to last and yet endured, buried not by erosion but by intention. They remind us that early society wasn't just survival. It was social engineering. It was psychological complexity. A people so deeply rooted in memory that they gave their ancestors plastered skulls and their gods hollow bodies. And when the cost of progress became too high, they stopped. Not every breakthrough leads forward. Sometimes civilization forgets. We ascend to Marcahuasi, a stone plateau where faces seem to emerge from cliffs and shadows. We argue over whether they were carved or imagined, whether the human need to see meaning in rock is evidence of art or illusion. But either way, the result is the same: reverence. Someone, long ago, stood in front of those rocks and saw something sacred, and we still do. That matters, because belief shapes reality, whether by hand or by mind. Then we come to the Ninth Legion. Not a myth, a military unit, tracked, paid, counted, gone, not in smoke or blood, at least not that we know, but into silence. Maybe they died in battle, maybe they were absorbed, disbanded, erased, but their disappearance exposes a larger truth, that even empires built on order leave gaps. Even the most documented age loses its memory. And finally, the Roman head in a Mexican grave. The kind of discovery that shouldn't exist, but does. An object whose presence in the wrong place, at the wrong time, reminds us that the world was always more connected than the lines in our textbooks suggest. All of these stories share something beneath the surface. They are disruptions, not because they are impossible, but because they force us to reckon with how we build the past. Archaeology is not just science, It is storytelling. It is interpretation, pattern recognition, and, yes, imagination. We find one artifact and try to recreate a world. But what if that artifact is the only survivor of an entire tradition? What if it's the exception that hints at a forgotten rule? That's what these 5 mysteries suggest, that we are walking on the edge of a vast, eroded archive. The Shigir Idol survived because of chemistry. The Ain Ghazal statues survived because they were hidden. The stone faces at Marcahuasi survive through ambiguity. The Ninth Legion survives as a silence, and the Roman head survives as a contradiction. Together, they tell us something profound, that history is not complete. It is a palimpsest, scratched over, rewritten, patched with guesses. And in between the lines, the old voices still whisper. Not everything has to be explained to be real. Not everything that's real fits the explanation. And so we end not with answers, but with an invitation to stay curious, to hold humility alongside knowledge, to remember that time is wide, and we, standing at the edge of it, are still learning how to see. These were 5 of the rarest ancient discoveries, but they are not the last. There are more stories buried in the peat, the stone, the silence, waiting, watching, wondering if we will ever understand. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. What if what we find is only what refuses to stay hidden? What if the real story of humanity is less about what's been discovered and more about what has already disappeared? The Shigir Idol forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Wood does not last. And yet, for most of our species' existence, it was the primary medium of expression. We call it the Stone Age because stone survives. But that may be a trick of time. How many wooden monuments, idols, and artifacts have simply dissolved into the soil? How many cultures lived in the forests and left behind nothing but rot? The idol is not just a relic. It's a survivor of a material world we barely remember, a ghost of biodegradable history. That same theme repeats at Ain Ghazal. There, people poured their energy and their forests into the creation of statues made of fire-hardened lime. Statues not meant to last forever, but to serve a purpose, then be returned to the earth. They buried their gods beneath their homes, and in doing so, preserved them, not for their own future, but for ours. And still, what we have is a fraction. Thousands of people once walked the plaster floors of that city. They spoke, sang, argued, loved. We do not know their language. We have no texts, no names, no songs. Only the eyes, watching, hollow, made from bitumen and chalk, staring across 9 millennia of silence. We are left with fragments. But even those can be overwhelming. Marcahuasi reminds us that perception is part of the puzzle. We don't just uncover the past, we interpret it. Do we see gods in stone, or shapes shaped by wind? The monument to humanity shows us that the line between nature and intention can blur, and maybe that was always the point. In a world where spirits lived in the land, the face didn't need to be chiseled to be real. It only needed to be seen. That vision, subjective, personal, mythic, is what gave it power. Even now, people travel to Marcahuasi to feel something, to stand in stillness and stare into rock and shadow, not to prove anything, but to remember something, that we are not the first to look at a mountain and see a mirror. Then there is the Ninth Legion, an absence so loud it echoes. In our need for order, for narrative, we invent possibilities. They died in battle, they were transferred, they were erased. But perhaps the truth is less tidy. Maybe they were never lost in the way we expect. Maybe they simply became invisible to the system that once counted them. A few survivors here, a name scratched off there. The bureaucracy moved on, and history forgot to look back. That silence is a kind of loss, not just of people, but of meaning. It shows how even an empire, vast, organized, relentless, can forget its own. And finally, the Roman head, a single object, found far from home, unwelcome in the timeline, yet undeniably real. Whether it arrived by driftwood, by trade, or by accident, it exists, it speaks, not in words, but in contradiction. It forces us to confront the possibility that the boundaries we assume between continents, cultures, centuries are softer than we think, that objects travel, that stories migrate, that the past was never as separate as our textbooks imply. And this, perhaps, is the unifying thread. These 5 discoveries are not connected by geography or time, but by their resistance to certainty. They remind us that history is not just what's known, it's what's left behind, what's been buried, what's nearly forgotten, and what still whispers from the edge of erasure. The Shigir Idol should have decayed. The Ain Ghazal statues should have crumbled. The faces in the stone should have gone unseen. The 9th should have been remembered. And the Roman head should never have been there. But they are, and that means something. Not just to scholars, but to all of us, because each of them says, in its own way, there is more to discover, more to question, more to feel. We are not at the end of the story. We are at the beginning of a deeper one. And the next chapter might already be beneath our feet. Imagine the world as a library, but not a library of books, of earth and ice and bone. Most shelves are missing. Most pages have rotted. Most ink was never written down. And yet, now and then, a fragment surfaces, a clue. Not enough to tell the full story, but enough to prove there was one. That is what these artifacts are. Fragments. And each one forces us to confront a deeper truth. That the timeline of history we're taught, linear, clean, ascending, is not the only path the past could have taken. Take the Shigir Idol. It wasn't just old. It was older than anything like it should be. Monumental art made not by settled farmers, but by hunter-gatherers. People we assumed were too busy surviving to carve meaning into wood. Yet here it stands, 5 meters tall, patterned with symbols, faces hidden within faces, speaking in a language no one alive can read. It rewrites what we thought we knew about the human mind 12,000 years ago. That's not just archaeology, that's philosophy. What does it mean that spirituality, abstraction, and mathematics predate farming? That monumentality didn't wait for cities, but rose from forests? That creativity came not after security, but alongside uncertainty. It forces us to question our assumptions about what drives progress. Then there is Ain Ghazal, a city that consumed itself. A place where chemical knowledge reached industrial scale, where people engineered lime-plaster for floors and faces alike, and in doing so may have stripped their land bare. This is not a story of collapse from invasion. It's a collapse from ambition. They pushed the limits of their environment and crossed them. And perhaps this is the most modern lesson of all, that intelligence does not guarantee sustainability, that even the earliest cities could fall under the weight of their own innovation. And yet, in the wake of that failure, they left us something. Statues buried with reverence, not abandoned, but interred, as if to say, we remember, even if we're leaving. Marcahuasi, in contrast, leaves us with ambiguity, not destruction, not erasure, but mystery. Is it art, nature, a hallucination of pattern? The answer may depend on the viewer more than the rock, but what cannot be denied is the resonance, the draw. Even skeptics feel it. Even those who call the faces illusions return with questions they can't shake. This tells us something profound about the human condition. We are meaning makers. We are story builders. And when the landscape whispers, we listen. Then, the Ninth Legion. Their silence is different. It's not physical. It's archival. It's the sound of a line going blank in a document that should never have skipped. What happened to them may never be known. But the absence itself is a kind of presence, a reminder that even the most powerful systems, Rome itself, had blind spots. The lesson isn't just that people disappear, it's that memory does. And the final piece, the Roman head in Mexico, is not just a puzzle, it's a contradiction. One that resists easy explanation. And that's what makes it powerful. Because in that resistance, it does what all great mysteries do. It holds space for wonder. It challenges certainty. It invites humility. We don't know everything. We probably never will. But that's not a failure. That's an opening. Each of these discoveries is a keyhole, not into another conspiracy or secret history, but into ourselves, our limits, our longings, our desire to connect across time, to find ourselves in the carvings, the faces, the vanished legions, and the silent clay. Because in the end, archaeology isn't about the past. It's about the relationship between the past and the present, between what was once real and what we choose to remember. The ground beneath us is full of stories, and every now and then the earth gives one back, not to answer all our questions, but to teach us better ones. What if we've underestimated the role of accident in what survives? How many artifacts escaped oblivion not because they were cherished or preserved, but because they happened to fall in just the right place? The Shigir Idol lay hidden in a bog, preserved by chemistry, not intent. The statues of Ain Ghazal were buried, perhaps ritually, perhaps just to put them out of sight. The head in the Aztec grave? Found because it was sealed in earth beneath a floor no one disturbed for centuries. None of these things were meant to be found. And yet, here they are. So what of the countless other idols, statues, ships, and stories that didn't fall into peat, or under plaster, or behind a sealed door? What of the histories written on perishable scrolls, the myths carved into wood, the songs passed mouth to mouth? They are gone, wiped not by war or conquest, but by rain, by rot, by time. The survivors are not always the most important, just the most fortunate. This is where the idea of survivorship bias enters our story. We build our understanding of the past based on what endures, but what endures is filtered. And that filter is not fair. Stone survives, so we believe ancient people were obsessed with tools and weapons. Bones survive, so we believe they cared most about hunting and fighting. But what if the real center of their world, their thoughts, their rituals, their beauty, was carried in wood, cloth, or voice? What if what we've recovered is only the coldest part of who they were? The Shigir Idol is a rare exception. It shows that people in 10,000 BC were carving complex figures, encoding spiritual beliefs in vertical planks taller than a man. That art didn't begin with the Greeks. That belief didn't wait for temples. That geometry, symmetry, and abstraction were alive in the minds of forest dwellers. And then it vanishes again. We have no second idol, no school of wooden monuments, just the one, the last page of a book whose rest has turned to dust. Ain Ghazal is also a survivor. Its statues weren't meant to last thousands of years. The reed cores have long since decayed. The plaster faces are hollow, and yet they outlive their makers because someone buried them, not in haste, not in rubble, but in alignment, in silence, in care. They buried the watchers, and in doing so, gave us a glimpse of a city that organized its memory into form. A city where identity was physical, plastered, painted, and then respectfully returned to the soil. But even that city forgot. As fuel grew scarce and plaster became poor, the art declined. The city emptied. The knowledge faded. What remains is a snapshot, a single, luminous moment before the lights dimmed. This fragility of memory is echoed in the story of the Ninth Legion. They were counted, paid, fed, armed, and yet they vanished without a line of poetry or lament, not because they were unimportant, but because the system failed to remember. Rome was meticulous, but even Rome could misplace its dead. This forces us to accept an uncomfortable possibility, that the gaps in our history are not always accidents. Sometimes forgetting is intentional. Sometimes it's institutional. Sometimes it's easier to erase than to explain. And finally, the Roman head. It survived not because it was treasured by modern hands, but because someone, centuries ago, thought it mattered enough to place in a grave. Whether it arrived by shipwreck, trade, or miracle, it crossed an ocean of time. And in doing so, crossed the boundaries of our understanding. All of this leads to a deeper realization. That history is not a fixed thing waiting to be uncovered. It is a living process, a dialogue between what once was and what we can still find, between what was meant to endure and what accidentally did. And that means the next great discovery could be anywhere, in a drawer of mislabeled artifacts, in the mud, beneath a highway, in the shape of a mountain we've walked past 100 times. All it takes is attention and the humility to listen when the past clears its throat, not to explain itself fully, but to remind us that it's still here, still whispering, still waiting to be seen. What is the shape of memory? Is it a straight line, a chronology of events, neatly stacked in order? Or is it a spiral, a pattern that repeats, looping forward, but always circling back? The deeper we go into these ancient anomalies, the more we see echoes between places, times, and minds that were never supposed to connect. The Shigir Idol and the Ain Ghazal Statues were created thousands of kilometers apart and millennia before formal writing systems. Yet both are monumental expressions of belief, shaped with care, encoded with mystery. One carved from wood, preserved by chance. One sculpted from stone-like plaster, buried with intention. Both are vertical bodies, faces stacked atop symbols, staring forward across deep time. They are ancestors, guardians, stories written not in words, but in presence. And now, think of the Marcahuasi plateau. There, the landscape itself becomes a face, not in precise lines, but in suggestion, not inscribed, but invoked. From certain angles, the rock transforms into human form. Just as from certain angles of thought, the past transforms into something larger than fact, a kind of mythology we carry forward. These places weren't built to impress modern archaeologists. They were built or chosen to make meaning, and in that, they all share something deeper than date or geography. They show us that the desire to give shape to the unseen is universal. Whether it's an idol rising from a bog, a plaster bust staring through time, a mountain face, catching the light, just so. Humans have always tried to capture the invisible, to make the sacred tangible, to bind memory to material. Even the Ninth Legion, though seemingly unrelated, falls into this rhythm. They were not artists or mystics, they were soldiers. But their vanishing is a kind of anti-memory, an absence that draws us in like a black hole. We remember them because they should be there, and they're not. We remember them not through what they left behind, but through what they failed to. It is the negative space that haunts us. And then, the Roman head in Mexico, a contradiction carved in clay. It doesn't just connect continents, it connects assumptions. It tells us that boundaries, temporal, spatial, cultural, are more porous than we think. That the idea of isolation is a modern invention. Ancient people moved, traded, drifted, shipwrecked, dreamed, and the objects they carried, deliberately or not, tell stories their descendants never intended. These 5 discoveries form a quiet constellation. Each one alone is a mystery. Together, they suggest a pattern, not of conspiracy, not of forbidden knowledge, but of lost continuity. They are breadcrumbs from a path we didn't know we were walking, signs that the ancient world was not a series of isolated bubbles, but a complex, messy, interconnected web, a network of thought and ritual and curiosity, one that we are only beginning to recognize, let alone understand. And that pattern doesn't just stretch back, it reaches forward to us, because we too are shaping memory into material. We carve, we archive, we document. We bury time capsules and send spacecraft carrying gold records of our music and maps. We leave messages for the future, not knowing if anyone will read them. And that makes us the same. The Shigir carvers, the Ghazal sculptors, the mountain watchers at Marcahuasi, the soldiers who vanished, the people who laid a clay head in a grave. All of them were trying in their own way to make something last, to be remembered, to leave a shape behind that said, we were here, we mattered. And so the shape of memory, it's not a line, it's not a spiral, it's a handprint on a cave wall, a symbol on a plank of wood, a face in the stone, a quiet act of saying, don't forget, even if you never knew us. We often talk about the past as something settled, dates fixed, events categorized, timelines drawn like railroad tracks, straight, uninterrupted, clear. But the truth is far less stable, because the deeper we look, the more we realize that the past is not still. It moves, it shifts, it resists containment. And every now and then, something surfaces that pulls the rails apart. The Shigir Idol did that. It showed us that monumentality wasn't born in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It existed 12,000 years ago in the forests of Siberia, not from empire, but from mystery, from memory, from spirit. It wasn't made by kings. It was made by someone with stone tools and a purpose that transcended survival, a purpose we still don't fully understand. The Ain Ghazal Statues did it too. They revealed that early urban life wasn't just about agriculture or shelter. It was about belief, ritual, community psychology. People burned their landscape to make lime. They created gods with eyes of tar. And then, when the moment passed, they buried them. Not with abandonment, but with reverence. The Marcahuasi plateau unsettles the line even further. Because it's not what we found there that challenges us, it's what we see. The ambiguity of those stone faces isn't a flaw. It's the point. They ask us to question how we define evidence. Do we need chisel marks to believe? Or is belief itself a kind of evidence? Does the fact that we still look up at those shapes and feel something say more about us, or about the people who once lived there? The Ninth Legion erodes the timeline in a different way, not with presence, but with absence. A military unit that simply fades from the record, not because they were never there, but because the system lost them, or chose to. They remind us that forgetting can be official, that records are written by people with priorities, with power, and that what we don't see in the scrolls may matter as much as what we do. And then there is the Roman head, the artifact that breaks the rule, not because it was supposed to, but because it did. It's the kind of object that institutions don't know what to do with. Too out of place to accept, too real to ignore. It forces us into a kind of archaeological limbo. We test it, date it, confirm it. But we still hesitate to let it rewrite the map, because doing so would unravel too much. And maybe that's the common thread running through all these stories. The tension between what we find and what we allow ourselves to accept. Because discovery isn't just about digging things up, it's about changing our minds. And that is always harder. These anomalies, these rare survivors, are not here to prove that history is wrong. They're here to remind us that it's unfinished, that we've been building a mosaic with missing tiles, that the map of the human past still has blank spaces, and in those spaces, possibility, wonder, humility. So what do we do with that? We could ignore it, file it away, treat each one as an exception that proves the rule. Or we could listen, not for answers, but for questions better than the ones we've been asking. Because maybe the real purpose of these discoveries isn't to disrupt our knowledge, but to expand it, to invite a more generous view of the past, one that allows for complexity, ambiguity, and awe. The past is not closed, it is porous, and we are part of it, not only as inheritors, but as interpreters. What we find shapes what we believe, and what we believe shapes what we see. History is not a museum, it's a mirror, and in that reflection, we are just one more layer of meaning, stacked on top of all the others. What if every generation rediscovers the past in its own image? What if the stories we tell about ancient artifacts say more about us than about those who made them? Each of the 5 rare discoveries we've explored, the Shigir Idol, the Ain Ghazal Statues, the Marcahuasi Plateau, the vanished Ninth Legion, and the Roman head in Mexico, has traveled not just through time, but through interpretation. They've been seen as miracles, as mistakes, as mysteries, but above all, they've been seen through the lens of the present. When the Shigir Idol was first pulled from the Russian bog in the 1800s, it was dismissed as a local curiosity, a folk relic. No one imagined it could predate the pyramids. Only when technology advanced, when carbon dating caught up, did the truth emerge. And suddenly, we were forced to see those ancient hands not as primitive, but as intentional, as capable of abstraction, scale, and meaning. The idol didn't change. We did. At Ain Ghazal, the statues were at first startling, then confusing, then revolutionary. Our understanding of Neolithic society shifted as the chemical complexity of lime-plaster came to light. The statues were not primitive dolls. They were engineered, assembled, activated, deactivated, and buried with care. They belonged not to a chaotic pre-civilization, but to a community negotiating memory, identity, and social structure through materials. It took time to see that. At Marcahuasi, the faces in stone remain open to interpretation. Are they sculptures or illusions? Perhaps both. In a world where the spiritual was embedded in nature, the question of authorship dissolves. Whether carved or chosen, the rocks became sacred through attention. And attention, after all, is a form of creation. The Ninth Legion, too, has been imagined in many ways. As martyrs, as cowards, as victims of politics or paperwork. But we may never know. Their story changes with each generation's understanding of loss and empire. Sometimes we imagine a glorious last stand. Other times, a quiet, bureaucratic end. The truth may be in between, or forever out of reach. And the Roman head? It has cycled through doubt, testing, denial, and reluctant wonder. It forces us to ask, not just, how did it get here, but why does it bother us? Because it doesn't fit. And when something doesn't fit, it challenges the authority of the structure we've built. These anomalies do not give us certainty. They give us tension. They live in the space between what is known and what is possible. And that's where the most interesting thinking happens. Because once we accept that the past is not a finished puzzle, but a living question, we can begin to approach it differently. Not as a search for control, but as a practice of listening. We become historians not just of facts, but of silences. We begin to read between the ruins. And in doing so, we honor the people who left these traces, not just for what they made, but for the questions they carried. What is sacred? What is remembered? What is forgotten? What lasts? These are not ancient questions. They are human ones. They echo from the peat bogs, from the graves, from the cliffs, from the vanished rosters of empire. And they call out not just to be answered, but to be felt, to be held, to be lived. As we approach the end of this journey, we are left with not one revelation, but many. Not a conclusion, but a mood, a shift in how we relate to the deep past, a recognition that we too are leaving traces, that we are not just interpreters of history, but participants in it, and that the line between now and then is thinner than we think. The final chapter awaits not to close the story, but to gather its pieces into something whole. What if the true value of these mysteries isn't in solving them, but in allowing them to remain open? In a world obsessed with answers, certainty, and resolution, there's something radical about letting a question stay alive, letting a story remain incomplete. The Shigir Idol stands as a monument not to what we know, but to what we almost didn't. Had it fallen just meters away from that bog's preserving chemistry, it would be gone, erased by rot, forgotten by time. Its survival is an accident, its meaning a mirror, a reflection of how much we still don't understand about our own beginnings. The Ain Ghazal statues, buried in darkness for thousands of years, show us that belief systems don't require permanence to have power. They were created with enormous effort, then hidden beneath the homes of the living. Why? Not to be preserved, but to be deactivated, honored perhaps, but also silenced. Not every act of preservation is about legacy. Some are about closure, and some, like Marcahuasi, defy even that. There is no neat burial, no sealed context, just stone and wind and the flickering shadow of a face that may or may not be there. Yet people still climb that mountain, still look, still wonder. The ambiguity itself becomes the artifact, the experience of doubt, of possibility, of sacred uncertainty. That is what has endured. The Ninth Legion, in contrast, is not sacred. It is logistical, bureaucratic, a machine of empire. And yet, its disappearance feels deeply human. To be forgotten, not as an individual, but as a collective, is a rare kind of vanishing. No headstone, no plaque, just missing paperwork and quiet decay. And in that silence, we hear something louder than all the trumpets of conquest. We hear the fragility of legacy, and then one final contradiction. A Roman head in a Mexican grave. It shouldn't be there, but it is. And maybe the real story is not how it got there, but how we responded. For decades, it was ignored, discredited, filed away because it didn't fit. Only when technology forced us to face its age, its authenticity, did we begin to ask deeper questions. Not about conspiracy, but about connection. The oceans we once saw as barriers may have been bridges. The timelines we built like walls may be more like tide pools, crossing, merging, reshaping with each new wave. And so we return to the beginning. 5 anomalies. 5 windows into a past that refuses to hold still. They did not give us certainty, but they gave us something better. They gave us pause. A chance to reconsider how we define civilization, what we think counts as advanced, who we believe matters, and how we tell the story of ourselves. Because these artifacts, all of them, are reminders that we've only just begun to scratch the surface of human time, that the archive of our past is still largely unread, that truth is not a monument, but a mosaic, made from fragments, some polished, some broken, some barely legible, but all part of something vast and living. So we leave these mysteries not as solved puzzles, but as sacred invitations to keep looking, to keep listening, to stay curious. Because in the end, the past is not behind us. It's beneath us, all around us, and sometimes still watching us, waiting for the moment we're finally ready to see. What endures? That is the final question. Not what we can prove, not what we can measure, but what survives, not in the soil, but in the soul. The Shigir Idol, the Ain Ghazal Statues, the silent faces of Marcahuasi, the missing Ninth Legion, and the inexplicable Roman head in a Mexican grave, each is a fragment, and together they form something like a memory. Not a complete one, but a haunting, a breath, a trace of something that once mattered deeply to someone, long before us, and that is perhaps the most human truth of all. That we build, we remember, we forget, we try again, we carry our dead, we carve faces into wood, into plaster, into stone, sometimes into nothing more than the wind. We disappear, and yet we leave marks, some accidental, some deliberate, some found only when the time is right. History is not finished. It is not fixed. It is not even fully known. It is something we are still uncovering, like archaeologists of meaning, digging not just into the ground, but into ourselves. Because each discovery we've walked through in this story asks more than just what happened. It asks, who are we, and who have we always been? We are creatures of wonder, of patterns, of storytelling. We seek faces in stone. We place gods beneath our homes. We march to the edge of the known world, and sometimes we vanish. And in our absence, others come. They find what we left behind and ask the same questions we once did. That is the cycle. That is the continuity. We are not separate from the ancient world. We are its latest chapter. And the stories we tell, the podcasts, the documentaries, the quiet thoughts at night as we stare into the dark, these are our statues, our idols, our offerings to time. So let this story be not an ending, but an invitation to walk more gently through history, to approach the past not as a solved equation, but as a conversation, a mystery meant not to be closed, but opened again and again, because the ground is still full of messages. The forests still whisper, the deserts still hold what was buried, and the oceans still carry pieces of us, adrift, waiting. So the next time you walk past a strange hill, or a weathered stone, or an artifact in a dusty case, ask yourself, what am I not seeing? What story is still trying to be heard? And what might I leave behind for those who come after? The past is not behind us. It is beneath us, above us, within us. A vast and fragile echo, still singing, still waiting, still ours to listen for. And that is where the real timeline begins.